Thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. My guest is Shlomo Gordon. He's coming to us from Israel. How are you, Shlomo?
I'm doing great.
Shlomo, I'm good. You were recently a candidate for the Knesset. And talk a little bit, before we get into the issues, talk a little bit about that. How did it go?
So it was quite the experience. I was running in the Zehut Party. Mm-hmm. The chairman of the Zehut Party is Moshe Feiglin.
Okay.
And basically the ideology is, on one hand, identitarian to summarize the entire thing is as much land of Israel as possible and as little government involvement in our life as possible. That's the overall ideology.
Sounds a bit like President Trump, limited government and nationalism.
Yeah, maybe like a combination of maybe like the average of Trump and Ron Paul.
Okay.
And then,
a more libertarian Trump.
Or maybe even a Richard Spencer and Ron Paul.
Oh, no, don't say that. By the way, he's actually might be coming on my show in the next week or two.
Oh, interesting.
Let me just point out that when you say a greater Israel, we're not talking about.
We're not talking about parts of Syria or Lebanon. We're not talking about aggression of going into attacking sovereign countries or anything like that. We're talking about places that have already been under Israeli sovereignty or military or disputed status, where we've kind of been
administrative state.
Like, for example, Trump recently recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan.
Correct.
That's great. I like Trump. I like that he did that. He doesn't need to tell me, though. I mean, it's the same way, like where I live in Judea. I live in disputed territory, and the place where I live is called the Mountains of Judah. That's the name of the area.
Well, traditionally, the region has, up until recently, been called Judea and Samaria, which is now called the West Bank. Before 1967, it was called East Jordan or West Jordan.
The West Bank. That's why it's called the West Bank, because it's the West. It was the West Bank of Jordan.
That's right.
Whereas Jordan historically is really the East Bank of Israel, and there's no such thing as a Jordanian people or There's Nabateans and Moabites and Edomites and all of these things.
Well, that's historical.
Historical, but they have nothing to do with the Hashemite Arabian kingdom that invaded. The Islamic conquest of Jordan in the 7th century and later. Right. There's no. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the people are the same people, but they have lost their identity that of Moabite or even the capital of Jordan is Ammon, which was
the Ammonites.
The Ammonites, exactly.
It's an ancient city, and also just as a historic note, the Palestine Mandate, which was created by the British in 1920. Mm-hmm. It included both the east and west bank of the Jordan. It included what is today Israel and Jordan. Right. And I think it was a couple of years later, some cartographer divided it into two pieces along the Jordan River, and said that no Jews would be allowed to live on the eastern bank of the river. That would be the Arab Palestine or Transjordan. Right. And that Cisjordan, main Jordan, would be the Jewish mandated Palestine. So, in a technical sense, there's already a Palestinian state. It's called Jordan.
And that name Transjordan, which is the real name of Jordan, is Transjordan. Trans means the other side, as opposed to a transsexual. Of course, that's a different.
Right, that's a whole different subject.
But trans means the other side, and that's actually the biblical Hebrew name. Ever HaYordan, the other side of the Jordan, and so Transjordan is actually a translation of the Hebrew name for the other side of the Jordan.
Right. Okay. So I want to bring things up till today. I just saw a very moving ceremony on the lawn of the White House where President Trump invited Rabbi Goldstein, who was shot at the San Diego Chabad House. And he stood up he invited him on the podium. He stood there with his hands in a cast. he thanked President Trump. It was very moving. And this gets me to an issue of what is going on in the United States and around the world with regard to anti-Semitism. Getting a lot of noise in the background, by the way, like a flushing sound. If you can just maybe cut that down. All right.
I'll try to mute when I'm not talking.
Okay. There's a lot. I'm really working to improve my sound generally, so I'm being kind of a stickler on that. So you have this increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism around the world and in the United States, and I think it had everything to do with the shooting at that synagogue in San Diego. Now, you were on a program with Adam Green recently. He has a huge following. He's got about 100,000 people. He strikes me as being a nice guy, sort of left of center, and him. But there's him, and there's also a couple of other YouTubers, and I'm operating in the world of YouTube right now, such as Ryan Dawson, another nice guy, very nice looking guys. Young, they're hip, they're reaching a younger audience like you are, and yet they're obsessed with anti-Israel propaganda and anti-Israel conspiracy theories. And they both sort of, in a way, careen a little bit toward the direction of anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. So my question to you, Shlomo, is, what the hell is going on here? I mean, this is old stuff that has been percolating forever. How is it that these younger guys are getting into this?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating phenomenon, and you've been around for longer than me, so I'm sure you know people your age who are like old school and they have it, right? And then there's like a good like 30 years probably, or 20 years where it's like not cool, and then all of a sudden it's like it's cool again.
Yeah.
So basically, I agree with you. These guys. On a personal, I think Adam Green is I would consider him a nice guy. I think Ryan Dawson is kind of a douche.
Well, whatever. Yeah. But I think they're both well-meaning.
I think Adam Green is more well-meaning. I think Ryan Dawson is more of in this angst, and he's just like wanting to. He just sees like a target that you can gang up on and attack, and he's just bringing his angst out against that.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised if he's an alcoholic based on this psychological.
Well, look, I don't want to get into like personal stuff. What I'm bringing up, look, I'm trying to mention. Hold on.
Green, I know better.
All right,
Adam Green, I know better.
Look, they're both sincerely trying to. They're both, I think, anti-war. They see Israel as being behind and to be blamed for the wars in the Middle East. They view Israel as being expansionist and beyond. And then when I say expansionist, I'm not talking about Eretz Israel right now. I'm talking about Middle East.
Syria, world. Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So let me first say the truth that's in their arguments. There is no doubt that a large amount of the swamp is in AIPAC. And that AIPAC is one of the major factors that every time that America wants, for example, to leave Syria, AIPAC is one of the major factors that wants to keep at all costs American presence in Syria. Now, I've said over and over and over again that I don't want that Israel's strong enough. I don't want America I don't want American troops to die for us. I don't want American troops to think that they're dying for us. Israel can handle all of our enemies. Our biggest enemy is Iran. We could handle them in a head-to-head. If Iran and Israel were to go head-to-head, it would probably be World War III, because that's just the nature of things. Another country Russia would get dragged in, America would get dragged in. That's just the nature of how these things happen. World War I got started off of a single leader getting assassinated. So that's how. So it would. So God forbid, I don't want a war with Iran. But Netanyahu, when he I'm not a fan of Netanyahu on many things, but when he sees Iran as Israel's number one threat, that is correct for sure. Hezbollah would not be a threat without Iranian backing. Assad has no interest in attacking Israel, but he might actually get dragged into a war with Israel through the Iranians. So so there's this reality where the Americans are in Syria and AIPAC is part of it. And so that's the grain of truth in the whole grand thing. And American Jewry and Christian Zionists and even the Mossad are involved in this. So that's the grain of truth. Now, how about others? So there's the grain of truth. Okay, now let's look at what's not true. First of all, who said that Israeli citizens want that or that it's in our interest? Okay, now I'll tell you that there's plenty of Israelis that know what the situation is and are not interested in keeping it that way. And if it were up to them, they wouldn't keep it that way. In addition to that, a lot of the attempts to destabilize Syria, it wasn't like the elders of Zion are sitting around and saying, "Oh, we're gonna balkanize Syria into 3 countries." No, it was a combination of the American military industrial banking complex that's the kind of stuff that they do, whether it's in South America or the Middle East or Africa. So you've got the American military industrial complex. You've got globalists in Europe who just want war, no matter where it is, they want war. Mm-hmm. And to destabilize and world and depopulating the world and all of that stuff. They like this kind of. They're just sick people, and that's in the EU and the Vatican and these different, the CFR, those kind of
right. The Eastern Seaboard liberal establishment, we used to call it.
Right. And then you've got Turkey and the Gulf states, that because Assad was on the other side, like they're like trying to be Sunni Islamists, and Assad is kind of going with the side of the Shia Islamists, even though he's an Alawite, it doesn't matter. They're trying to go with the Shia side of things. Mm-hmm. And then Israel was just kind of like going along with all of these other sides. So like when Israel goes along with globalism and with Sunni Islamism and Sunni expansionism and all of this stuff, when Israel just goes along with it, then it's like Israel's the mastermind, and they start giving you these pictures of the Nile to the Euphrates, and they start all this junk. And then, I've seen tweets and videos of Syrian girl, Maram Susli, where she talks about Greater Syria, and she talks about how Israel is Greater Syria, and she talks about how Syria needs to take over the West Bank. And I'm like, I sent her a map, and I'm like, in order for Syria to take over the West Bank, they would have to go through the entire, I know that we disagree about the Golan, but for Syria to take over the West Bank, you'd have to take over the whole Galilee.
The Galilee region.
Which is completely Israel, not disputed, nothing from 1948. So a lot of it's just you've got a lot of Arabs that actually they want Arab expansionism, and then they're just reflecting. They're saying, well, we want expansionism, so what do those Jews want? The Jews must want the same thing. So then they point their fingers and they say, Greater Israel, Jewish expansionism, Israeli Zionists. They love saying Zionists. So
they love that, yeah. And Zionist is Israel, yeah. And Zionism is nothing more than the national and religious aspirations of the Jewish people, nothing more and nothing less.
And the biggest thing to just completely take apart this entire theory is, tell me, Charles, what is the longest and most expensive and most deadly American war of the past couple decades?
Probably World War II. Vietnam.
That's further back than I'm talking about.
I'd say Vietnam.
So since Vietnam.
The Afghanistan war.
Afghanistan. Yeah. Afghanistan is totally, it started from the CIA, black ops, smuggling opium, and the whole discovery of lithium in Afghanistan. That's why it's American imperialism, it's American expansionism, it's American.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think it's America trying to stop the Mujahideen and bin Laden. But I want to wait. I want to just point out that you get into the grains of truth here with regard to certain elements of the Israeli establishment and the Jewish establishment in the United States, the very ultra-liberal secular establishment, I may point out, that is part of this international globalist view. They want to turn the world into a one-world ant colony, whatever. And that it's not unique. It certainly runs contrary to Jewish principles. And they're usually people who are at war with God and at war with Judaism. These are not, what I would call good Jews. They're Jews, but they're not good Jews. Right. And the thing is that they are people who did, the so-called neoconservatives who did drag the United States into the Iraq War. Let's face it. And people, they were in the Bush White House. They were also there with plenty of Protestants and Catholics who were high level as well, who believed in this global thing, and they're kind of, into kind of a changing of the world by force, a messianic vision that is completely contrary to the Jewish idea. I'm getting that noise in the background again here. Shut that down. That is completely contrary to the Jewish idea. Israel, I would argue, even with this establishment, which is in sort of semi-conditions of control in most countries of the world today, nevertheless seeks peace with its neighbors. Going back to Ben-Gurion, it goes back to the mission of Israel, which is to hold out an olive branch of peace to its neighbors and to exist and coexist peacefully with its non-Jewish neighbors. Now, the fact is that Iran is seeking to commit aggression against Israel. Israel has no beef with Iran. Israel has a traditional friendship with Iran and with the Iranian people going all the way back to the days of Cyrus the Great, who issued a proclamation recognizing Israel and calling for the rebuilding of the temple. And you could read it in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is part of the Pentateuch. And the point is that it is they who are seeking aggression, and Israel as a sovereign state has the right to defend itself in any way it needs. It doesn't need to explain such things. But they're into this whole conspiracy theory that gets back to the old Jewish conspiracy theories about the Jews secretly trying to control the world. And they're kind of working in tandem with some of these fundamentalist Protestant ministers online that I'm watching, who's it, Ben the Baptist over in Florida, and there's a couple of others who are pounding this whole issue and that the Jews are secretly trying to control the world. I think we talked about that. I want to move on to another subject here.
Can I just say one more thing?
Of course.
Is that every group that has power, there's no doubt that there are different groups of Jews. For example, Adam Green likes to talk about Chabad a lot. Chabad is
I was going to get to that, yeah.
Yeah, Chabad is actually is an organization that, out of all of the different religious Jewish movements, he's correct that Chabad is probably the most powerful religious, and they really are a messianic sect.
Sure,
so,
they are.
And so,
but in the best
Chabad
sense. It's not. Yeah, they're not trying to bring about the Antichrist. I mean, they're not. It's a Jewish understanding of Messiah, which is to raise the spiritual level of the Jewish people so they can be prepared to usher in the rebuilding of the temple and the coming of the Moshiach. But the point is that that's not by force. It's not by force of arms. Now, the Adam Green and others, and I've heard this come from other sources as well, they have a whole conspiracy theory around the Chabad, which frankly had everything to do with this gunman at the Chabad house in San Diego. I don't care what else they say. That the Chabad, which is an organization that, I'm getting that noise again, which is an organization that you could almost credit with saving Judaism after World War II, when we were at a very low point spiritually. They went around with missions around the world to talk to Jews, not non-Jews, and to try to bring them to wrap tefillin and to try to bring them back to spirituality. They did an incredible job of bringing Jews back to knowing God and knowing the faith. They're not involved in some kind of a physical world government. They're not in trying to bother with anyone else other than Jews, and they're trying to bring about faith among Jews in the same way that Protestant ministers try to bring about faith in their communities and try to bring people to their faiths. There's nothing going on here, and yet they're into this whole thing. And it seems like the cornerstone of their conspiracy is that the Chabad movement is trying to spearhead the bringing about of the 7 Noahide laws as a way to rule the world. Now, I want you to talk a little bit about what the 7 Noahide laws are, because it was President Reagan who actually recognized the Noahide laws, or it might have been Bush Sr. And it's not a governing document, and it's not particularly Jewish. It is simply 7 principles by which the nations of the world should live, and if they don't live by them, then they don't. What is the deal with that?
I think with the first one, you can make it. The first one really expels all these ideas. The first one is that the peoples of the world, that each people should make some sort of government to govern themselves, to have some sort of system of justice. Right. It doesn't say that you have to make a government. You have to make a fake government that will really be ruled by the Jews. No, it says the first thing is make your own government and rule yourselves justly.
Exactly. Okay. So in other words, the very first principle says, no, we're not trying to control anybody. The Jews they're simply saying these are basic moral codes for the world.
Our biggest concern as far as the nations and the geopolitics of nations is that they don't control us, that we be free. That's Maimonides, the Rambam. He says, don't think that in the days of the Messiah that the sun will stop rising and the moon and that everything will change. The difference between the world that we live in and the days of the Messiah is shi'abud malchuyot, that the people of Israel will not be ruled over by the nations, that we will not be enslaved by the nations, that we will be a free nation. Not that we enslave them, that we won't be enslaved, that we will be free, that we will be able to have that we will be able to have our own government with our own army and move around freely in our own land. And we're really moving in that direction. Thank God. And it's a good thing. And any nationalist or any libertarian should be in favor that the Jewish people, as every day that goes by, the Jewish people are realizing our sovereignty and our liberty more and more. Now there's a bunch of young Israeli kids that are reading, the Zehut Party had a lot of awakening people to libertarian kind of ideas. And also a lot of 15-year-old Israeli kids are reading, what's his name? Peterson.
Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson, yeah. A lot of 15-year-old Israeli kids are. Jordan Peterson in Hebrew is like a bestseller.
Oh, yeah, it says stuff is your Jim.
So this is a direction. Other than that first Noahide law, the other things are common sense things like not cutting a limb off of a living animal. You don't even need to keep kosher. Yeah. Just like in Africa,
it bans murder. These are talking about murder. These are basic human standards.
Yeah, I actually found I'm interested in religions, and so I've actually read the texts of different religions in the New Testament. It actually lists 4 of the Noahide laws. It's Paul, Shaul.
That's right.
It's Paul is saying to keep 4 Noahide laws. And if you look at the other 3, he's saying not to drink blood, to not eat food that was offered to idols, to not engage in adultery or sexual, weird sexual stuff. Right. And one other thing. And then I said, okay, well, what are the other 3? And then I looked at the other 3 and I said, okay, to put a government over yourself. Okay, well, he was talking to people in Rome, so they had a government. To not murder. So the law in Rome is to not murder. Right. And the third thing is to not steal. And the law in Rome is to not steal. So the 3 things he didn't say would have been obvious to the people he was talking to. And the other 4 he says to do. So even a good Christian who actually follows the New Testament, which on these 7 things, I think the majority of Christians don't steal, don't chop limbs off of animals. I think these are things that a Christian already does. So they already are keeping. So Christians are generally already keeping Noahide laws better than Muslims. Most, it seems. The only problem with Christianity, where Islam is probably better, is that Christianity especially Catholicism is the worst, where Catholicism straight up took a Jewish man who was crucified, and they turned it into an idol, and so in that way, when you go into it, that's why, according to Maimonides, he lived 1,000 years ago, he never heard of Protestantism. It was hundreds of years before Protestantism,
right?
And so he said you can pray in a mosque if you have to, because in a mosque there's the Muslims are
images.
They're more strict than Jews, because Jews had a development over time where we said, well, it's okay to have a picture of an animal or a person or whatever, as long as you're not worshiping it.
Well, I want to just interject here. Yeah. First of all, I disagree with you about the business of the image of the Jewish man on the cross as being an idol. I don't think that Catholicism, in fact, my understanding is that Rashi actually thought about this issue and studied it for many, many years, and eventually concluded that Christianity was not involved with idol worship, and that it is not an idol, it is an image, and it does run against Jewish sensibilities, but they're not actually worshiping it. It's not the same thing as idol worship. Christianity is not pagan. They worship the same God we worship. And as far as the Noahide laws, they are incorporated into Christianity, is my understanding. In the book of Acts, St. James, who was a devout Jew, by the way, and who inherited the ministry of Jesus after his death, and he controlled it for about 30 years. When he sent Paul out on his mission, and he was reluctant to do so, and it was really Paul who wanted to go to the Gentile nations, he made sure that he incorporated the Noahide covenant into the mission. So Christianity is grafted into the Noahide covenant anyways, and that it is not a ruling document. It is a moral and ethical guidestone for the world that doesn't, it's not something that can be imposed, and there is no Jew that would try to impose it by force. So this whole conspiracy about the Noahide covenant, as you point out quite well, Shlomo, right off the first covenant, it's very easy to disprove. Now, the other thing that I'm hearing a lot of grumblings about, this one goes way back, and that is this business of the Talmud as being evil and satanic, and that it says that Jesus is boiling in shit, and this, and it has all these horrible things about Jesus in it, which first of all, the Catholic Church, censored the Talmud anyway, and they burned it under King Louis. But my understanding is that none of this stuff is true. The Talmud, first of all, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's the Mishnah and the Babylonian Gemara mostly. Those are the two authorized.
So basically, you have, first thing that people need to understand is what the oral Torah is. And I'm guessing that a lot of people who are going to watch this are probably Christians. And so what people should understand is that the New Testament has also, if you know what oral Torah is, you can see that a lot of the discussions in the New Testament, when Christians read it, they probably, I think they don't appreciate a lot of the discussions that are going on. There are oral Torah conversations going on, things like washing of the hands. Do you have to, or is it just a tradition? And there are places where Jesus and the Pharisees disagree, but it's very clear that Jesus was much closer to the Pharisees than he was to say the Sadducees.
He was a Talmudist. When you read, let me just interject, because I had the opportunity recently. E. Michael Jones is a regular of mine. I admire his scholarship. He's a brilliant man, but he's way out to lunch on this issue.
I saw one of your discussions. It was fascinating.
Yeah, he's a great man. He's way out to lunch on the issue of Judaism. He thinks it's a revolutionary faith because we killed Jesus, which is another question that I'm looking into, and I actually don't think we did. But putting that aside, he's embraced this whole view of the Talmud as somehow creating a new religion, and it's not consistent. But when he directed me to a quote in the New Testament, it led me to read the New Testament or parts of it. And when you read the dialogues that Jesus engaged in, and the parables and the Sermon on the Mount, and he was, you could describe him as well versed in Talmud. At least, if not a Talmudic scholar. And that the Talmudic methodology before it was written down, Jewish tradition has it going back to Moses and Sinai, but even if let's say, looking at it from a more secular standpoint, you could say that it at least goes back to the Greeks and to the Persian times, when and all it is governing principles of how the Jewish society is to govern under the Torah and to interpret the Torah. It does not contradict the Torah. It is not holier than the Torah. The Torah remains the central entity of Jewish life. It is second to the Torah, but it is seen as divinely inspired. However,
Right.
There's nothing in there. Is there anything in there that's derogatory toward Jesus?
Okay. So first of all, to answer the question about the derogatory, yes, there is, and I'll get to that.
Okay.
So first of all, so people can know what the oral Torah is and why it's necessary, and why it was. First thing to know is why it's called the oral Torah. It was for a long time forbidden to write it down. Okay, and so the question is, so why did we start writing it down?
Right.
Because you have to imagine that when there were huge, after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era, and Jerusalem being completely razed and sown with salt and just completely destroyed in the most catastrophic way anyone can imagine, and the traumatic experience that is for the Jewish people, and that we still have trauma from that, more than from anything else, more from World War II, more from anything else. We have trauma from our temple being destroyed, and it's generational trauma. It gets passed down, I believe, even in the DNA itself.
Oh, I reject that. But anyway, go on.
But the reason that the oral Torah needed to be written down first as the Mishnah was, I want anyone to imagine that they lived in America, and the written Torah of American culture or society is the American Constitution. Okay, so if let's say the only thing written down was the Constitution, everything else was oral. So, for example, Thanksgiving is an oral holiday. It doesn't say in the Constitution that you have to celebrate Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
So, imagine if there's a huge war and American society is going to be destroyed, and you have only a few scholars that they know all of the traditions and they are experts on American culture, and so they want to write everything down before it gets destroyed. And so they start writing down books that says, on the last Thursday of November, you keep Thanksgiving, and if it falls on this, then you have to do it the week before, or you do it on a Wednesday. You have an entire society that people just live it naturally, that you need to write it all down now and keep it in books, because otherwise you'll lose it forever.
Right.
And
Exactly.
and that's what happened when Rabbi Yehuda Nasi had to write down the Mishnah in the land of Israel in the Hebrew language, in Mishnaic Hebrew. That's what happened in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And then what he wrote down, it's mostly one guy. There's also the Braitas, but it's mostly one guy, and he's writing down all this stuff. So he's jotting it down as fast as he can. He's writing it like notes. So someone else comes and tries looking at his notes, and they say, I can't understand these notes. So people understood that they had to write down
Commentary.
commentary on it. And so that happened both in the 4th century, in the 3rd and the 4th century in the land of Israel. That's called the Jerusalem Talmud. It's also called the Palestinian Talmud in English.
Right, that's right.
Interestingly enough. And that's more land of Israel based, more Hebrew and Galilean Aramaic. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud, but it was really written in the Galilee. And then you've got then there were, at that same time, there were many Jews living in Babylon, and it was actually the Jews who were living in Israel. It was very difficult for them. They were under foreign control. First, they were under Roman control, and then when the Roman Empire became the Christian Byzantine Empire, it became even worse. They were under this terrible Byzantine. They were just terrible for Jews, and so they were really risking their lives to live in the land of Israel. And that's where we see the stories like Rabbi Akiva, and the 10 martyrs that were really.
Well, that happened in the Bar Kokhba rebellion.
That was before Christians. That was in Roman. But we see this terrible persecution that happened in the land of Israel, to the point where eventually there were basically no Jews left at one point. The land of Israel basically becomes a Christian country, not because all of the Jews converted to Christianity, just because foreign nations came and invaded our land and brought a foreign, basically a foreign religion at that point. And so the Jews in Babylon, they were in a stronger position, and so some of the stuff that you see them talking about is influenced by Babylonian culture, but I've seen all sorts of bizarre theories about the Babylonian Talmud. But it was Jews from the land of Israel who ended up in Babylon. Some of them were there from the exile,
right?
And they didn't come back to the land of Israel with Ezra and Nehemiah. And some of them joined because it was just a safe place. They were Zoroastrians. They were tolerant of Judaism. And it was a safe place for Jews to live and thrive. And that's why the Babylonian Talmud is a much more complete version. It's written in Babylonian, Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. Mm-hmm. It's more complete. And there was a century of Savoraim who went over and corrected stuff. So it's much more, because it was more developed. Even though I personally like a lot of things in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's nothing you can do. The
right.
Babylonian Talmud is more complete, and so that's why over time the Babylonian Talmud gained the status of the
authoritative Talmud,
the authoritative text. Right. Though there's some interesting things like the Rambam, the Maimonides tries to go according to the Jerusalem Talmud in a lot of situations, and Rabbi Nachman, who I'm a big student of. He taught that in the days of Mashiach, we would go according to the Jerusalem Talmud.
Okay.
So anyway, there's all this interesting stuff, but at the end of the day, we went according to the Babylonian Talmud. Now, as far as Babylonian Talmud, people need to understand that this is volumes and volumes. This is stuff that if you manage to read the entire Babylonian Talmud, you are a huge scholar. I have not even come anywhere near that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to read a page a year is huge. Yeah, I mean, it's enormous.
Yeah, it's a huge amount to read, and it's complicated, and you need commentary on that, and it's complicated, and some of the stuff I personally don't even bother with because I say there's other commentators that they studied all this stuff. Let me just read their summary of it because it's way too.
It's like reading the law library. It's Jewish law. It governed the Jewish community for the 2,000 years of exile. The Mishnah, as you say, was written by Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was a very good friend of and collaborator with the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, right. A philosopher emperor who wrote himself enormous works of philosophy. It was at a pretty good time for Jews in Rome. It was a pagan time. This is before Christianity. It had nothing to do with Christianity. And that the Babylonian Talmud is the authoritative Gemara that was written in Babylon, which was Zoroastrian. It wasn't Christian anyway. So the whole thing is really nothing to do with Christianity.
Right. It overall has nothing to do with Christianity. But what people need to understand is out of this huge library, so you've got laws that sometimes what they agree on in the Babylonian Talmud isn't actually Jewish law today because the Shulchan Aruch says something else.
That's right.
And other traditions that develop.
And there's a lot of contradiction.
There's Ashkenazi and there's Sephardi and there's all this stuff.
But even in the Talmud, the methodology was very dialectical in that you'd have conflicting comments made by different rabbis. All of it would be left in. It was influenced by the Socratic method of the Greeks. In that if you read works of Plato and Aristotle, you see that they had a roundtable discussion. They would ask a moral question, and they would go around, and you'd have people screaming at each other in completely opposite positions, but they leave it all in there. That's how the Talmud's written. It's very Greek in a way, and it's not something that, again, this is not the equivalent of the Torah. It was not a reinvention of Judaism at all. It was simply the codification of Jewish law so that Judaism could survive once we lost sovereignty, and it actually is responsible in many ways for our survival over the 2,000-year diaspora. Now, getting back to the subject, I want to get into what does it say about Jesus?
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So again, just real quick. So out of this huge thing, there's laws. There's stuff that doesn't even actually become law, and then there's
What do you see?
Wait, one second. My wife just brought me something strange.
Okay.
Anyway, so out of this huge thing, you've got most of it is law, and then you've got all sorts of weird stories. There's stories about life on other planets, and there's all sorts of crazy stories out there. Sure. And rabbis say you don't even believe half of the stories. They say anyone who believes all of the stories is crazy. Wait.
That's not Talmud, though. That's Midrash.
That's Midrash, but there's Midrashim in the Talmud as well. There's like Agadata, there's Agadot. There's stories in the Talmud. Sure. And then there's people, but if you don't believe any of the stories, then you're a heretic. So anyway, out of all of that, there's a bizarre story in the Talmud that I actually made a video about it one time. I might have taken it. I don't remember if I left it up or took it down, but that it says, it's this bizarre story where the nephew of the Roman Emperor Titus,
yes,
who was Onkelos, he was considering converting to Judaism,
right?
And so there's this bizarre story.
And he did convert to Judaism,
right? So you've got this guy, right? But you've got this guy who at the moment
he's a Roman citizen,
he's a Roman, he's a Gentile, and before he makes the decision to convert to Judaism or not, he as a Gentile does something that's forbidden in Judaism. He does a seance. Now, do seances work? Do they not work? That's an argument in and of itself.
That's a pagan argument.
Right. It's also a pagan argument. So it's a pagan who does a pagan seance, and he has this whole story that he experiences, and the Talmud's just relating what Onkelos said after Onkelos converted. He told people this story, and it was recorded in the Talmud. So the whole thing is bizarre. And
this is where you have Jesus boiling in excrement.
Yeah,
now the thing is that, by the way, let me comment on that. Onkelos is a very well-respected Talmudic scholar. He was a Roman citizen who converted to Judaism. Before he converted, they say that he was very much into a high-level pagan practices and worship. And he was recounting something that had happened before his conversion, and it was recorded, as you say, in the Talmud. The reference to Jeshu, was it Jesus that he was talking about? There's a lot of people named Jeshu. I mean, it's not,
there's places in the Talmud where Yeshu seems to be, some people say Yeshu is a derogatory name. I'm not sure about that. I think that it was just a short version of Yeshua. I think it was just in the Galilean Aramaic. It seems like they dropped the guttural letters a lot of the time. So it was probably like a nickname of Yeshu. And so in some of the stories, Yeshu is probably referring to other people, but right. In this particular story with Onkelos, it's for sure referring to Jesus.
I'm not sure it's for sure, but
in my opinion,
okay.
And so anyway, Onkelos does a seance of three people. The first one is his uncle Titus. Right. Titus says, don't, he says, he asked Titus, what's important in the world to come? He says, Israel, the people of Israel, the Jews. And he says, should I join them? He says, don't join them.